guys, welcome back to the Mill Social Talk podcast. Again, this is Leroy Viamille, managing broker at Mills Realty. And today's, I got something I want to talk about. It's a really heavy topic, but I want you guys to, I want to be able to give you some information on what's been happening. Now, today, the reason why I'm choosing this topic is because Illinois Realtor had a topic, and they've had a actual discussion about how redlining has affected our community. So this is a kind of heavy topic, but before I get into that, I want to give you a little bit of information of where this came from. So I'm actually backpedal, and I'll try to be brief and concise about what I'm saying. I want to backpedal to what exactly I'm talking about. I am talking about redlining today and how that will affect. I want to give you 3 case studies personally of mine that I've been involved with, and so I'll give you an idea of how this affects us as a community, the minority community. So I say the word redlining. What is redlining? So redlining is a discriminatory practice by which banks, insurance companies, etc., refuse or limit loan, mortgages, or insurance within a specific geographic area, especially inner city neighborhoods. Now, some of you may have heard the word redlining, not sure what that is. And if I want to break that down, just saying, a lot of times when we as brokers, and I have the responsibility in order to let folks know whether or not that I believe that they're being redlined. And later on in the program, I'm gonna go through 1 or 2 scenarios where I know that for a fact that my clients were in that really position of being redlined. And of course, the banks, they're using discriminatory practices in order to not give the loan or limit the loan of my clients. So again, it's a discriminatory practice by the bank to limit loans or refuse to give loan. But this happens in healthcare and grocery stores. You've heard of neighborhoods where there's no grocery stores. And stuff like that. So all that is part of redlining. But as a broker, a managing broker at Mills Realty, I'm going to deal with the mortgage and the banks because that's really my areas of expertise. So I'm actually going to do that instead of going to healthcare and all that kind of stuff. So remember now, because this is something that we'll be talking about, redlining. So we go ahead and say we limit loan. So let me give you a brief history of redline. So I took this from, I actually went and kind of grabbed this from the internet. And so let me read this to you slowly so you understand this. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, unemployment rates were high and many people could not make their mortgage payments. A wave of foreclosures swept the country. To keep people in their homes, the federal government established what's called the Home Owners Loan Corporation. Home Owners Loan Corporation, right? Its goal was to refinance mortgages with a better term, like lowering rates and longer repayment period to help people make payments and avoid foreclosures. That happens now with FHA, and so that kind of, but back then it was called the Home Owners. To determine what loans would guarantee, the Home Ownership Corporation sent people to appraise neighborhoods in cities across the U.S. They document the type of housing in neighborhoods along with information about the people who live there. They also catalog detrimental influences with racist description like infiltration of Negroes and mixed race. as characteristics that lower a neighborhood's value. So this is what happened in the 1930s when there was a high rate of unemployment. Basically what it's saying is the banks, the government went in and say, hey, you know what, these neighborhoods are owned by Negroes. These neighborhoods are not great for investment. These neighborhoods, and so that's where the term redlining is coming from, because they were targeting the, you don't have to be the poor class of people. Now, luckily, that doesn't happen today, but then I'm gonna say it does and it doesn't, but I'll come back to you later on in the program. The reason why I'm doing this program is because I want to show you what was discovered by realtors, who we as realtors, we have the responsibility to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, that everyone is in a position where they can own a home and everyone is not treated discriminatory. So, but that happened in 1930. Does it happen today? I'll say yes, but I'll give you some evidence why that is still happening, and I'll give you some personal evidence also to show you, to tell you why that is still happening. So 1930s, that happened, right? Now let me continue. The government back then used these classifications to determine whether to guarantee loans. Banks used to determine if people were eligible for a mortgage and wouldn't provide loans to buy a home in a declining or hazardous neighborhood. Now, the word hazardous neighborhood is saying that the poorer class of people, right? What happened is the banks use these verbiage to say, you know what, we're not going to go through that process. We're not going to help these people buy loans. And these were all basically done in inner cities. They were not done in suburbia, right? Because in the 1930s, you got to remember, everybody was moving out to the suburb, and it was assumed that more people in the suburb had more money than the people in inner city. So basically, these hazardous neighborhood, and the banks chose these neighborhoods, and I'm back to the word redlining. And by the way, this is just a teaching. I'm just trying to teach this session so people have a great understanding of where this word redlining came from. So the government used these words to say we will not be able to loan, or the banks use, or insurance company, or etc. use these words to say, you know what, we're not going to go into those neighborhoods. Okay, so that's basically. Now, this was redlining, right? So another thing that the government and the banks did back in the 1930s, and by the way, this is just documented. So I just want to, for those of you listening to the podcast, and listen to the Mills Realty Social Talk podcast, I want you to encourage people to kind of listen to this. Now, the government, or I'm gonna say the banks, when they figure out all these, where all the poorer class of people, they draw lines on a map, and I'm sure many of you have heard of that. They draw lines on a map to say, we will not lend here. So if a person want to buy a property and they're in that particular block or area, it's so much harder for them to purchase a property, and that's just institutional racism. But that's where they said, no, we're not going to loan to you because you live in this area. So the government draw boundaries around neighborhood based on residential race and depriving them of resources and opportunity, effectively racializing poverties in cities across the U.S. This is structural racism, where racism is built into the rule of society. So, as I just said, it's structural racism, but that happened in the 1930s. Now, while these people, while the banks, the the bigger players, I'm going to say, were sending out people to categorize where people live, where they, how many people live in that property, or whether there's development in that area. And they were trying to redline and say, well, hey, these folks don't work and there's too many people living here. And while they were doing that, they created a sort of a graph to create that boundaries, right? But I took out 4 questions from this graph and this that would say, these are why we're not going to loan in this particular neighborhood. There's 4 questions. There's a couple of different questions, but I want to take out 4 actual questions that me and you can understand. So when it comes to the building, first of all, they wanted to know what's the age of the building. And if the age of the building was 50 years plus, now here are the 4 questions, right? The 4 questions were age of the building, repair of the building, occupancy of the building, and whether or not they were the home ownership of the building. All right? Remember, it's average age, repair, occupancy, and ownership. Now, here are what the graph has said. It's saying that if the average age, now this is the 4 things that's easy to look at to say we are not going to loan to you guys because these are some of the requirements, or these areas. Okay, not these guys, but these areas. So if the building is 50 years old or more, if the building is 50 years old, that may be a problem. That is a problem. That may be a problem. If the repair is poor, that's also an issue. If the occupancy is 90% in that property or in that neighborhood, that's also a problem. And if the ownership is 40% or below. So if we look at this, we'll say, okay, so the building is, first of all, is more than 50 years old, so it's old. But you got to remember, in the 1930s and 40s, there was a movement out to the suburb, right? There's a movement out. So you had a lot of newer constructions in that time, right? Because there was a movement out. There's a migration to the suburb. So 50 years or older. So if you put this into context, 50 years or old, and the repair is poor. So we're saying it's an older building, and no one does a repair. But coincide with that is an older building, no one does the repair, and there's a lot of people living there. So there says there's 90% occupancy. So you see how that meshes together. There's 90% occupancy, and so 50 years poor, 90%, and the ownership is 40% less. So they're saying not a lot of people own here. So why should we give them money? Because there's, what I think the number is 90% of the people living in poor, unrepaired home, and the buildings are older. So that's sort of where the bank starting and mortgage companies on a red line. You can see how that comes into play. Okay, so that's sort of for the questions. Of course, some of the questions were, what's the price? It was $500,000 to $14,000. Those are the price at the time. $5,000 home, $3,000 to $7,000. So they were cheaper homes. But you see how that comes into play. How we're redlining, how the banks started putting the minority, or I'm going to say the poorer class of people, in a box to say we will not offer you any help because you are poor and you're this and you're that. So that's sort of those were the building questions that the banks were asking about those neighborhoods and other neighborhoods to determine whether or not to give them money. So it's back to the word redlining. All right. So redlining. All right. So as I continue here, now in where are we gonna redlining. No, now we were looking at there's four things that the banks, four colors that the banks were using. Four colors. The banks were using green. So green was okay. Once these maps came in, it had green, gray, yellow, and red. All right. So these areas are mapped out in colors. So when the bank's giving a loan, they look at the map. Okay, you're in a green. Beautiful, you can get a loan. Gray, you're still okay. You're still okay. You're gray, you're still okay. So we will still give you a loan because you're gray. You're still desirable. That's the word they use. You're still desirable. You probably work, whether or not you work at a company, you're making X amount of dollars. You may not have the greatest credit, but you're desirable because of where you live, and they feel like you will still make your payment. So you're desirable. We can afford to do that. Now the yellow is a little tricky because it's like, you're in a declining neighborhood. So that's kind of okay, what are we doing here? Are we giving you a loan? Are we not giving you a loan? So when you're in a yellow neighborhood, they're like, okay, what do I say here to you? It's desire, I don't know yet, but let me get some more information on you, right? So you see how the bank was kind of getting that done. And then when you're in a red, which mostly go on to the more the less affluent, the minority, minority. I'm saying minority could be blacks, whites, Hispanics. I mean, there's no. I'm gonna say poor for that matter. When you're poor and you live in a red neighborhood, you're like, it's gonna be an uphill battle for you to get a loan. So that's where we're looking at what's called redlining. They look at you and like, so I really want you guys to understand where this came from, because it's important for I'm going to say the poor community, not the affluent, but whatever race you are, black, white, Hispanic, Indian, whatever race you are, I want you to understand this. This is where this came from. Is that still happening today? I'll get to that. Because I read, and the reason why I'm going to get to that, because that came in from the Illinois Realty Association. The realtors came up with a study to show that yes, these things are still happening today. It may not be as prevalent as what happened in the 1930s, which I don't believe it is. I really don't believe it as prevalent as, but I think it's still happening somewhat today, and we'll kind of figure it out, and I'll tell you about that. So I'm gonna say, and I've heard of this. I've never seen it. Now on online, you can kind of see, if you really research this, you'll notice that the banks had maps that they would go through to decide who has it, and whether or not these map was on their wall, I don't know. But if you Google and you look into redlining, you'll see the banks had maps to say that we can't do this. Now, I would say the government used these classifications, and we're talking about the green that's best, the gray that's still desirable, the yellow that definitely declining, and the red that is hazardous. So the banks use these classifications to determine whether to guarantee loans. Banks use them to determine if people were eligible for a mortgage and wouldn't provide loans to buy homes, and wouldn't provide loans to buy homes in a declining or hazardous neighborhood. As I just said, the bank used these to determine, okay, you know what? I ain't gonna do this with you. And I've heard of stories, but I don't. Let's say I've heard of stories, but it's a matter of I wasn't back there in the 1930s. I mean, we take it in class. We as a broker, I've been educated on the fact that yes, there was many redlining going on in the early 30 years ago, 1930, 40, 50, 60. There's a lot of redlining going in, and as that changed, and as FHA comes along, it's less and less and less and less and less. And it's my hope that it doesn't happen, that it still doesn't that it doesn't happen today. That is my hope. So that was the situation when it comes to redlining. Now in this episode, I'm talking about that, but I want you guys to listen to the next episode, because I want to give you 3 of my personal scenario as we continue this topic. This is it's going to be a 2-part series, and I don't want to. It's going to be 2 parts where I'm going to tell you of where it has come and what and how I have experienced this particular redlining on a first-hand basis. This is not someone else's experience, but it's my personal experience. So in next week's episode, I'm going to I'll get into that, right? So keep in mind, these boundaries were drawn. And let me just continue reading this, and then next week we'll come back with the episode. So the government used these classifications to determine whether to guarantee banks, used them to determine if people were eligible for mortgage and wouldn't provide loans to buy homes in neighborhoods. This was redlining, drawing boundaries around neighborhood based on residential race and depriving them of resources and opportunity, effectively racializing poverty in the city across the U.S. This is structural racism, where racism is built into the rule of society. So that's all I'm saying. So we have redlining throughout the U.S. Okay, this wasn't a Illinois thing. So if you're listening to this podcast in California, New York, or wherever you are, I mean, we're in Illinois, so I got to talk about Illinois. If you're listening to this, then I want you to come back and listen to my personal experience in next week's episode. Due to time, we'll come back and we'll talk about these 3 things, and it'll be a shorter episode, but I want you to listen to it to find out how it affected me personally. So hey guys, again, this is Leroy at Mills Realty, Mills Realty Managing Broker, talking about the Mills Realty Social Talk podcast, and I want you to listen to next week's episode to see how it affected me personally when it comes to redlining. So thanks again for listening. Please, if you know someone that's buying, selling real estate, please share this podcast with them. It's so important. Any other information, please reach out to Mills Realty. And you can listen to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. Again, it's Leroy at Mills Realty. Thank you guys for listening. See you next episode.
No one ever sees me.